Good day, everyone. My name is Chet Koneczny, and I'm here to talk to you about the game of lacrosse, specifically how easily I think it could be integrated into your curriculum, all in a student and teacher-friendly language. I began putting the framework for this presentation together in Teachers College back in 2009, using research that was considered best practice at the time. Most of the curriculum references are from the Ontario Guidelines for Grade 9 Healthy Active Living Education. However, the concepts of how to integrate lacrosse into the physical education curriculum will remain the same from province to province and grade level to grade level. This presentation is an attempt to tackle the issue of how to get lacrosse into schools, not only from a physical education and recreation standpoint, but equally as important from a cultural one. As a society, I feel that it is absolutely necessary for educators and all people alike to acknowledge the broken treaties and broken promises of the past, try to learn from our mistakes, and work together to help rectify the systematic racism as outlined in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of 2015. If any of you have not read the report and calls to action in this very public document, I highly suggest you give it a read. Lacrosse is a great tool to meet many of its recommendations, which is not easy in complicated learning situations of up to 30 kids in a class from diverse ethnicities and different socioeconomic backgrounds. At the end of the day, there are lots of suggested protocols currently available for teachers to decipher when it comes to lacrosse, but teachers need to see examples of what it looks like in practice, not just in principle. What you'll find moving forward is that lacrosse meets the needs of curriculum documents from all of the Canadian provinces and territories and could be quite seamlessly integrated into a month-long lacrosse unit in a physical education setting. My aim is to give you a practical approach on how to integrate lacrosse into your curriculum, while also developing comfort in assessing individuals and small teams using best practice approaches. But before I get into the lesson plans, I must first define my terms assessment and what I consider best practice in teaching. What is assessment? It's the process of gathering evidence that accurately reflects how well a student is achieving curriculum expectations. This is what I believe to be the biggest missing link as to why lacrosse has not been successfully integrated into school curriculums thus far. We haven't provided teachers with a means to assess the students participating in lacrosse. So what is best practice in teaching? There's been a fundamental shift in the roles of students and teachers in the learning process. In the traditional paradigm, the teacher is the active agent leading the conversation with prompts for students to follow. In the new paradigm, the student should be actively engaged in their own learning process, where the teacher is the lead learner guiding the student along their own self-interests, teaching them self-assessment, knowledge, and other skills related to their interests. The new student sets their own individual goals, monitors their own progress, determines their own next steps with the help of the teacher's feedback and guidance. In a sense, assessment becomes instruction, and the instruction becomes assessment, an ongoing process administered over a period of time. The student sees what they're going to need to get graded in, and ultimately the teacher delivers instruction related to those assessment criteria. As Chappis put it back in 2002, learning is easier when the learners understand what goal they are trying to achieve, the purpose of achieving the goal, and the specific attributes of success. At this point, it is also appropriate to acknowledge that most of the research in the next few slides is from Chappis. When effective instruction and assessment are integrated and interactive, together they create a climate of student co-conduction and ownership of their learning. It becomes a collaboration between student and teacher, and the opposite of passive reception. Setting goals, making checklists and rubrics, and feedback and homework, all related to the next steps established and co-created with the student, creates a gradual release of responsibility geared towards total independence in a process called scaffolding. This approach has been proven to increase overall student motivation and self-esteem. So how does assessment as instruction work? Assessment can ultimately be used for, as, and of learning. Using assessment for learning, at first you do a diagnostic evaluation, and at this point you're seeing where the learner is and the readiness to learn new information and new skills while also obtaining interest and learning preference information. From there, you make a formative evaluation of where the learners are in their learning, where they are going, and what needs to be done to get them there. This occurs in a frequent and ongoing manner throughout the instruction and becomes the object of discussion between the student and the teacher. This helps them make informed decisions about their next steps and areas that can be improved on their quest to satisfy the assessment material. Formative assessment is an essential component of classroom work proven to raise the standard of achievement. It involves gathering info by a variety of means, including observations, discussions, written work, self and peer assessment. Assessment as learning is where the magic happens and the assessment starts to transform into instruction. This being highlighted by what the students are doing as a result of the formative exercises they have now completed. If formative assessment is to be productive, students should be trained in peer and self-assessment. Peer assessment helps the others, but also the self in seeing what others have done. It also cultivates a common understanding of goals and outcomes and a common conversation about the learning that is going on in the class. Students can choose what advice to follow or not. At the end of the day, students are generally most concerned with maintaining or restoring positive feelings more than anything else. It's very important to capitalize on those teachable moments during this process. Self-assessment will help the student navigate through the curriculum as an individual, and the learner becomes an individual thinker. Assessment as learning focuses on the explicit fostering of the student capacity over time to be their best accessory. Assessment of learning is the final stage of the learning process where a summative evaluation is made by the teacher using assessment info from throughout the semester to assign a grade to the student. Formal testing will always be a necessity, as unfortunately there are political commitments to external testing and the responsibility to report to parents using strong evidence. The Growing Success document of 2010 sets out these policies and practices for assessment, evaluation, and reporting in Ontario. This requires that instructors gather info from a variety of means, which also ensures that it's valid and reliable. In the end, the teacher makes their professional judgment, reflecting the most consistent level of achievement with special consideration given to recent evidence. A snapshot of what this all looks like from a student's perspective. It's a cyclical process or continuum of assessment and instruction. Starting with the learning goals of the curriculum, aka backwards design, the student creates and reaffirms their individual goals as they relate to the curriculum guidelines and later the success criteria. I will give several examples in future slides. These goals should be recorded and discussed throughout the year, beginning with the first few classes and evidence of the student's current position. As I mentioned previously, the success criteria should be co-conducted between the student and the teacher, with goals and feedback always linked to the success criteria. Again, I will show lots of examples of what this looks like. The next component is peer and self-evaluation, where the students are generally honest and reliable, as I've found in my past experience. Feedback helps create a scaffolding effect where incremental steps that lead to the attainment of individual goals are had. Feedback should be about the particular qualities of the work, with comments related to specific aspects of the work and suggestions for how to make it better. Eventually, you return to setting individual goals for the next assignment, establishing next steps, skills to work on, areas to improve, etc., and essentially reevaluating your individual goals moving forward. The major branch of the phys ed curriculum that we will be designing our lessons from is the physical activity branch, which is now called movement competence as of 2015. Nonetheless, not much has changed and the concepts remain the same in my purpose of trying to get you comfortable delivering and applying the sport of lacrosse within your curriculum. The other three branches of the phys ed curriculum in Ontario, active living, healthy eating, and living skills, could very easily involve Indigenous concepts as well, but we will continue to focus on the game of lacrosse in this presentation. As you see here, there are overall and specific expectations in this as well as the other three branches of the phys ed curriculum. All must be accounted for in instruction and assessment over the course of the year, although summative evaluation focuses on the overall expectations and teachers are able to choose which specific expectations should be evaluated for the overall expectation. The big ideas within the overall expectations usually have lots of layers and provide a way to connect, recall, and apply the knowledge. You should always be able to answer the question of why we are doing this. Here are the specific expectations from the physical activity branch of the phys ed curriculum, which could very easily be woven into any sporting context. The bottom line is that this narrative of curriculum expectations needs to involve Indigenous culture and the sport of lacrosse for numerous reasons that I will continue to extrapolate on. Before we get to the meat and potatoes of the lesson planning, the other consideration we have to make before eventually making a summative assessment, as we learned earlier from the Growing Success document, we must ensure that evaluation is gathered from a variety of means. These are 4 areas known as KICA, first being knowledge and understanding, where you are using foundational skills, facts, terms, characteristics, and symbols in your learning. Another area a student might be able to demonstrate learning is in the thinking area, related to goal setting, decision making, problem solving, and conflict resolution. The other 2 areas of achievement are communication and application, whereby you may communicate understanding between self, peers, and teachers, for example, and application just being the application of lacrosse-specific skills taught in the lessons, which we'll see here in a minute. A student may not excel in all areas of achievement, but the teacher may use their professional judgment when evaluating. And this is all dependent on the individual learning goals of the student. They may not be the best player of the game, but they can communicate a drill. They may not be able to communicate a drill, but they have lots of knowledge of the facts and rules surrounding the game. They may not have the knowledge of the game, but they may be able to think critically about issues relating to the game of lacrosse. From a teacher's perspective, starting with the curriculum guidelines and using the backward design framework for lesson planning, the teacher first identifies the overall expectation and specific expectation that the class will be working from. In this case, demonstrating knowledge of strategies that enhance participation from an overall expectation, and from a specific expectation describing career opportunities related to the sport. We also need to identify the achievement criteria to be met from the KICA grades, which moving forward I will eventually be giving examples of all 4 using different curriculum expectations each time. In this case, we have demonstrating thinking using critical and creative thinking processes. These criteria often need to be reworded in more student-friendly language or using other analogies that they can relate to, but the student should be able to come up with a plan for how they want to meet that expectation. These initial lesson plans are ultimately from a teacher's perspective, yes, but students may see it differently and the teacher should be accommodating to that possibility. So what does this look like in practice? I would suggest a month-long lacrosse unit over the course of a phys ed semester, and I'm about to show you how. In lesson number 1, starting with assessing for learning, the first step would be to have a diagnostic evaluation. During this time, I would show a period of a high-level lacrosse game, ask questions, and give a brief explanation on the gameplay, while also pausing for skill demonstrations where appropriate. At this time, you may also engage any lacrosse players in the room, which would only enhance the conversation. The next step, for formative purposes, would be to deliver a presentation on the history of lacrosse and its origins amongst the First Nations people of North America, aka Turtle Island. I would engineer a group discussion surrounding Indigenous culture in Canada as it relates to the curriculum, and at the same time examine and reflect on the students' belief systems while taking notes of the ways that their ideas could either be challenged or reinforced in future lessons. I would also be identifying leaders in the group, critical thinkers, and those who don't seem engaged in the discussion. These observations, both formal and informal, would continue throughout subsequent lessons while further trying to engage individuals that have special needs. To prompt students on how to hit the curriculum objectives, I may throw out the prompt listed here on demonstrating how lacrosse can or has been a vehicle of success for opportunity in Indigenous youth. But also, I may just provide some work examples and then have them come up with ideas as to how they could satisfy the curriculum objectives. For homework, students could then come up with the success criteria for their own rubrics based on the class discussions and eventually used for their own personal assignment. During lesson number 2, students could brainstorm in small groups how they could relate to the criteria in a think, pair, share methodology. They would write down ideas as a group, sort and categorize and revise and refine them, which you can easily translate into a rubric by making sentences out of the ideas generated. On this slide here is what I hypothetically came up with for my prompt, should any students choose the prompt I suggested. I would utilize this material or other student-generated rubrics to match the individual student needs, interests, and learning goals within the school community context, also making IEP amendments where required. This rubric could then be used for peer and self-evaluation before submitting the final product by the end of the lacrosse unit. The lesson would then conclude with students allowed free time to play with the sticks and balls informally, where they will be introduced to the fundamentals in the next lesson. During lessons 3 to 5, the application achievement criteria related to skills application of lacrosse fulfills multiple overall and specific curriculum expectations. Early on for formative purposes and later on a retest basis for summative evaluation, I've created a tool in substitute of a rubric, which I believe is the most objective measure of the skills and drills being taught, that being loose balls, cradling, passing, catching, and shooting. Further, in the final 2 weeks of class, interpersonal skills such as teamwork, fair play, and leadership could be evaluated on an ongoing basis by the self, peer, and teacher. This fundamental skills tracking sheet has 2 trials for each of the fundamental skills in lacrosse, both in static and dynamic orientation, and with pre-trials in lessons 3 to 5 and a post-trial at the end of the lacrosse unit. These drills could easily be accomplished in small groups of 3 to 4 with rotating stations around the gym, or otherwise as a large group. These drills are also part of bigger practice plans found on the www.laxlife.ca practice plans part of the website, and they are interwoven where the skill is first introduced, students have a chance to explore the skill, and then later have their assessment. Example modifications for students with other learning goals unrelated to the skills part of the application might be to create a rubric for interpersonal skills, which was also listed as part of the application achievement criteria. These aspects of interpersonal skills could then be put on display in the final 2 weeks of the lacrosse unit during the class tournament. The tournament would be held on the odd days, whereas the even days could be for chalk talk sessions where students have time to discuss their next steps, finish, and later present other assignments from the lacrosse unit. The fundamental skills tracking sheet would essentially substitute something like this, where you're grading the different stages of the different movements. For instance, throwing a lacrosse ball, the preparatory movements, the execution, and the follow-through of the movement. The tracking sheet itself is an objective way to have the skills speak for themselves. This rubric here is an example of a generic rubric that could be used during the 2-week lacrosse tournament and involves team tactics related to invading territory both offensively and defensively. Alongside the interpersonal skills expectation, this targets the sports strategies aspect of the application achievement criteria and is best used as a self-assessment tool from my experience. All 3 of these resources I just provided are very easy to follow, as you can see, and will be made available as an adjunct to this presentation. Lesson number 6, following 3 lessons of basic skill development and pre-trial assessment, brings us to more formal assessments of learning that has happened. This while also using another achievement criteria that must be met in order to ensure that student assessment has come from a variety of means, this being the communication criteria. Here I have also targeted different expectations from the curriculum, and I'm not going to go through another development of a rubric for this assignment because of the time restraints and redundancy, but I believe I've showed you how easily something like this could be generated with student co-conduction as a best practice. The task at hand would be to use oral, visual, and written techniques and report on the importance of any movement principle in an isolated or combined lacrosse skill. Then identify to yourself, a peer, or a teacher the appropriate movement principles as well as specific situations they might be used in a lacrosse game. Following 4 more lessons of beginner skill development practices related to the application achievement criteria, lesson number 10 begins to bring team concepts into more intermediate drills using multiple skills in conjunction. This last example targets the knowledge and understanding achievement criteria and also targets the last of the required specific expectations in the physical activity branch of the former grade 9 curriculum guidelines of Ontario. The variety of achievement criteria used to satisfy the curriculum guidelines, knowledge and understanding, thinking, communication, and application creates triangulation of the summative grades. Student work includes products, observations, and conversations, and now we can produce a grade at the end of this, which ensures reliability. Again, you co-create a rubric as a group using a basic T-chart and discussing the curriculum guidelines with flexibility from the teacher in terms of creativity of the students. The teacher can provide examples of a past video submission, also provide an in-depth walkthrough on higher level skill to the group, and discussing the major and subtle movement skills that are at play, as well as many of the other terms and safety issues that are worth mentioning. The task in this case would be in groups of 2 or 3 to combine 2 or more basic movement skills learned so far in the lacrosse unit and create a more advanced lacrosse drill to be delivered to the class on tournament game days. Identify the requirements of the drill, including basic equipment needs, preparation, associated terms, and specific safety issues that maximize performance and participation. The lesson would then finish with the teacher allowing time for the groups to interact and come up with ideas and skills and drills they will later teach to the class, with the teacher scheduling them where appropriate as a warm-up drill or prior to games during the class tournament. Here are the guidelines that I use for tournament play in a phys ed class or for intramurals. The ball used in the program should be a high-density foam lacrosse ball, not a real lacrosse ball. There's no contact between the stick and the body, and there's no contact between the stick and the stick. There's no body contact at all. There is a safe circle of 1 meter around the player with the ball and their stick. This program does not utilize goalies, and teachers should be careful about positioning students during the drill. They should also ensure that the balls not in use are kept in a safe area away from the field to avoid students stepping on a ball, and sports safety goggles are recommended, although not required under OFIA. For intramurals, helmets and gloves must be worn, and bumping hips may be permitted, i.e. rule number 5 being exempt. Other rules that you might consider incorporating is the 5-step rule to incorporate passing and multiple pass rule, should those be a problem. The OFIA website has more guidelines, but I prefer this condensed version as I prefer its simplicity. The key, as promoted by the Federation of International Lacrosse, is emphasizing fair play, inclusion, safety, and sustainability. Ultimately, as gym teachers will come to know, common sense always prevails. Here's a list of notable principles related to lacrosse from the 10 guiding principles put forth by the TRC. Principle number 3, reconciliation is a process of healing of relationships that requires public truth sharing, apology, and commemoration that acknowledge and redress past harms. Principle 4, reconciliation requires constructive action on addressing and the ongoing legacies of colonialism that have led to destructive impacts on Aboriginal people's education, cultures and language, health, child welfare, the administration of justice, and economic opportunities and prosperity. Principle number 8, supporting Aboriginal people's cultural revitalization and integration of Indigenous knowledge systems, oral histories, laws, protocols, and connections to the land in the reconciliation process are essential. Reconciliation requires political will, joint leadership, trust building, accountability, and transparency, as well as a substantial investment of resources. Principle number 10, reconciliation requires sustained public education and dialogue, including youth engagement about the history and legacy of residential schools, treaties, Aboriginal rights, as well as the historical and contemporary contributions of Aboriginal peoples to Canadian society. You would think that given lacrosse's capacity to satisfy the TRC's call to action, that it would be a mandatory practicum in all of the teachers' colleges and kinesiology programs across Canada. When I went through these programs back in the late 2000s, all of the practicums for students were arbitrarily using the popular sports that we see in the majority of our phys ed classes today: basketball, volleyball, soccer, football, gymnastics, etc. However, as we now know from this presentation, lacrosse satisfies all of the curriculum objectives in the same capacity as any of these other sports. So until the policymakers establish lacrosse as a mandatory practicum for aspiring teachers, how can we expect any of our phys ed teachers to feel completely comfortable delivering lacrosse, as they will undoubtedly resolve back to what they were taught in their formative years?